Hi, how's it going? It's Michael Redmond here. Now, you may well know me as a stand-up comedian, which I actually was for over 30 years. Or you might know me better as Father Stone from the Channel 4 sitcom Father Ted. And if that happens to be the case and you're still wondering how I am after all these years, well, I'm still fine. So what am I doing here? Well, I've kind of retired from stand-up, but I keep coming up with, the odd idea for a joke or a comedy monologue or a comedy routine and that kind of thing because to be honest with you, I quickly realised that taking up gardening in retirement wasn't going to satisfy me enough. It wasn't going to do it for me. Jesus, gardening. And anyway, I don't have a garden, which is probably why I was often found standing in other people's gardens over the years. So what's this all about? Well, this is my comedy podcast, which I've called "What Are You Doing in My Garden?" I suppose the best way to describe it is it's a short weekly podcast in which I'll be, throwing in a joke or two or talking about a range of things from, say, drink driving in Ireland in the 1970s, my chance encounter with Joanna Lumley, pole vaulting geriatrics, and lots of other things. But no poetry. Absolutely no bloody poetry. So if you have anything to say or add to what I've been musing on the podcast, it'd be great to hear from you. Or in fact, also if you have any questions about Father Ted, I'd be happy to answer them as well. The email address for the podcast is whatdoyoudoinmygarden@gmail.com. How you doing? How's it going? It's Michael Redmond here again with episode 5 of my podcast, which is called Father Stone Could Well Have Been Joey the Lips from the 1990s iconic film, The Commitments. I'll be talking about that later. But first I'd like to thank you all for the amount of downloads or uploads, whatever you call it anyway, of the podcast. It's brilliant. Been downloaded from all over the world. I mean, you kind of think it might be downloaded in English-speaking countries like, Britain and Ireland and Australia, America and so on, but it's been all over the place, Far East, Middle East, Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, Russia, Japan, Bulgaria, all over the place. It's brilliant. And but I was thinking, looking at the website where it gives you all this information about which countries the podcast has been downloaded in, and it's been. I was thinking in places like Japan and Bulgaria, are they native Japanese or are they just tourists? Or are they native Bulgarians or just tourists? I kind of hope they're native people because then it'd be brilliant. I could eventually get my podcast translated into Bulgarian and Japanese, and I could be huge over there. Who knows? I'll go for Japan first, I think, and then I'll take Bulgaria by the neck. We'll see how it goes. But it has been downloaded from all over the place. But there is one thing I notice. Not one download from Finland. Not one single download from Finland. The Finns haven't bothered their arse to download any of my episodes. So I'll tell you what, the next time I'm going to my local farmer's market to buy a reindeer steak, I won't. I'll deliberately go to the market and deliberately not buy a reindeer steak. That'll teach the Finns not to upload my podcast. Bloody Finns. But I've been thinking, I've had a bit of feedback from some people. Some people think that the podcasts are maybe a little bit too short. I don't know. If you think that is, if you think they should be longer, is there any particular things you'd like me to talk about? Anything you'd like me to say, or anything that sort of, comes into your head and you think that that'd be good to hear in the podcast? Just let me know. That'd be good. Now, here's another thing. When you're talking about somebody or thinking about somebody, then suddenly 10 minutes later, without any reason or they just pop up, that you meet them in the street or meet them in a pub or something like that. Just pure coincidence. Now, I was going over some notes for my podcast a couple of days ago, and I've been thinking about the Finns and the not buying reindeer steak anymore in my farmer's market. And a couple of minutes after I'd been thinking about that, a reindeer didn't walk into my estate, but a deer did. Now, I was thinking about the podcast. I sit in my sitting room and it sort of looks out at the front. It's a kind of a crescent. It's a cul-de-sac, so it's not a thoroughfare. But this deer wandered into the crescent and it just strolled along. It didn't look fretful or ill at ease. It looked like it was just coming home, so sort of as if it lived in the crescent or something like that. I wasn't in the least bit concerned. I just wandered around the crescent, and then I noticed, I was going to think maybe I should ring somebody about this, but I noticed the serial killers had taken it into hand. Now, you're probably wondering who the serial killers are. I'll tell you who they are. I have a couple of neighbours who live about 2 doors up from me, both in the mid-60s, and the wife bears a very strong resemblance to Rose West. In fact, I'll rephrase that. She's the fucking image of Rose West. It is quite actually scary when you meet her. And her husband doesn't look like Fred West, but he is the spitting image of Harold Shipman. So that's why I call them the serial killers. Rose and Harold, the serial killers. But they seem to be taking the deer into hand, so I leave them to it and get on with things. Okay, as I already told you, in this episode I'll be talking about how Father Stone could have been Joey the Lips from the 1990s iconic film The Commitments. But first of all, I'd like to say that I'm feeling I'm in quite an upbeat mood today. I'll tell you why, because I broke up this fight outside a pub last night between two rival gangs, all by myself. What happened was I came around the bend of my car going a bit too fast and lost control. I've never seen a fight break up so quickly in all my life. They scattered in all directions. It was fantastic. Now that joke is it's loosely based on an actual event. In fact, no, I'll say it's not even loosely based. It's very closely based on an actual event. But the reason I mentioned that joke is that it's actually it didn't happen the other night. It happened 20 years ago because it's the first joke I ever wrote. And I was living in Dublin at the time, and I don't know where the joke came from. Well, I do in a way kind of know where the joke came from, but at the time I had absolutely no plans to be a stand-up comedian at all. Genuinely, it hadn't entered my head because I tell you, well, main reason I suppose there was no comedy clubs in Ireland, and I wasn't really aware of the so-called alternative comedy circuit in London. So, and I'm not just sort of typical comedian, not like sort of Billy Connolly where I'm out there. I'm very sort of laid back. So I kind of assumed to be a comedian you'd have to be something like Billy Connolly where you're kind of really out there and get people. But that was not the case. I'll tell you why later about that. But when I wrote that joke, I had no plans to be a stand-up comedian. But the reason it probably came into my head was, apart from the fact that it was based on a slightly actual event, at the time I was writing kind of topical one-liners for radio shows. It was called the Mike Murphy Show. It was similar to if you're in England or Scotland or Wales, similar to the show Terry Wogan used to have on BBC, where it's kind of playful, sort of chatty show. And I used to submit sort of topical one-liners, which were read out, which Mike Murphy used to read out. And the reason I got that was because I was quite friendly with Dermot Morgan from Father Ted, because we lived near each other and we were quite chummy and we were both involved in comedy. So, but he'd been doing that. He'd done it about a year before me, and he said you should send in scripts and see what happens. So I did, and they started reading them out. But I mean, it's, I couldn't make a living out of it. I think I got 15 quid for each gag, and so I kept doing it for a while anyway, because it was nice to actually have your name read out on radio. But I could kind of see it wasn't going to lead to anywhere. I said I had no plans to be a stand-up comedian at the time. So I'd written this joke and I don't know where it came from, but it was probably about a year down the line after I started writing scripts for radio. I realised there's nothing happening here. There's no comedy clubs in Ireland, or RTE don't do any comedy on television or even radio. You can put in the things I did were in another radio show. They don't actually do comedy shows, and so there's no future here. And in that time, I'd heard about the comedy circuit in London. I think I'd actually sort of tuned into Radio 4, and I think I heard some clips from the Edinburgh Festival. I think it was Edinburgh Fringe at the time. But they were talking about in that program they were talking about the comedy circuit in London. So I thought, there's nothing for me here. So I'd written a stand-up joke, and then I thought, well, I'll give stand-up a go. And so I sat down and started trying to write jokes specifically for stand-up this time, because I'd kind of almost decided in my head that I was going to go to London and give it a go on the London comedy circuit. So I started writing jokes. I can't remember any of the other jokes I wrote, but I know the second joke I wrote, which I still use, is that, like most people from Ireland, I was born a Catholic, which actually came as a bit of a shock to my parents, who are both Jewish. That was the second joke I ever wrote. And I still use it because it's a bloody good joke. If I'm doing it in Scotland, I say, which came as a shock to my parents, about Protestants, because it goes better. The Protestant bit, Catholic bit goes better down in Scotland. But it used to be, in London, when I started in London, it used to be Jewish. So that was the second joke I wrote. So, and I did write other jokes, but none of them were memorable. I can't remember any of them apart from those two. So I basically decided, I made the decision, I'm going to go to London, and this was kind of late 1986, I think. So by Christmas I'd made the decision, and I booked a boat ticket to London just to go into the comedy circuit. Now I say boat ticket, that probably sounds a bit strange at this day and age, but back in 1987, Ryanair, a lot of people slag off Ryanair, and probably rightly so, but they weren't around then. Aer Lingus had a total monopoly, so if you wanted to go to London, fly from Dublin to London, it was at least 250 quid, maybe even 300, because Aer Lingus had a total monopoly. So unless you were really rich, or maybe, I think they had some student flights, I think, that were cheaper, but apart from that, if you were emigrating to England or London, you went on the boat. So you got the boat from Dunleary, which is near where I lived, to Holyhead in Wales, and then you got a train down from Wales to London. But it took bloody ages and ages because it was called the mailboat, and the reason it was called the mailboat was because they carried the mail from Ireland to England or to Britain, and it was offloaded on the train in Wales. So you got on the boat it was usually late at night, I think, because the boat went around sort of 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and you'd arrive in Holyhead at about 5 in the morning. And this was in January, by the way, and it was cold, wet, dark, and freezing. So you arrive in Holyhead, and but because they're transferring all this mail from the mailboat onto the train, and probably have the train driver taking a big break, it took about an hour and a half before you actually get on the train, and you're left in this kind of it's kind of like a holding cell almost. It was a horrible, empty, deserted place with these kind of those kind of cracked plastic seats, probably from huge agricultural Irish arses sitting on them over the years. I don't know. But there's also a bloke, some drunken Egypt from County Leitrim, who just kept singing "I've Been a Wild Rover" over and over and over again in this holding cell. Anyway, we eventually got on the train and got to London about 5-6 hours later. But the only sort of upbeat side of the train journey was that I managed to write another joke on the train journey from Holyhead to London, which was it was kind of specifically geared towards the English market, because I said I've been living over here for a few years now. There's one thing I noticed you have in England which we don't have in Ireland: Birmingham. So I basically arrived in London with 3 jokes. I probably had other bits and pieces, I don't know. But the comedy circuit in London was so much different than it is now, because now there must be, I don't know, I haven't counted them, probably about 2,000 comedians circulating about, maybe even more, I don't know. But when I went to London in 1987, it was much smaller. It was only about 30 or 40 comedians, I think, maybe even less than that, I don't know. So the competition wasn't anything like as fierce as it is now. And the way it worked was you get work. There was a magazine called Time Out, probably still is, I don't know if it still exists, Time Out, but they would have all these listings for entertainment, sort of cabaret or dance and music, and they had a comedy section as well, and it would list all the comedy clubs and who was playing at the comedy clubs, and also there would be a phone number at the end, and you just ring up and ask for an open spot. So I arrived in London. I managed to find a horrible little bedsit in a place called Turnpike Lane, which is near Finsbury Park. And I had no money, and there was no mobile phones then, by the way. There might have been one of those huge things that you saw the odd person take, but most people didn't have a mobile phone. And I couldn't afford a landline because I was skint. I just sort of had a few bob. But I was lucky. There was a phone box at the end of Turnpike Lane, and that's basically what was my office, because I discovered that between 11 o'clock and lunchtime, not many people would use it. So I used to go there every day between 11 o'clock and lunchtime, and I'd ring up all these clubs and ask for open spots. And it was really simple then, because I said there were so few comedians and there was so little competition. Most places would just give you a gig within a week or two, an open spot within a week or two. Now I'm told, I was speaking to a comedian who's sort of starting off now, he says, you can wait for either up to 6 months, sometimes even longer, to get an open spot. That's an open mic, non-paying spot. And even if you do well in the open mic, it could be a year before you get a booking in the club. But it was so different when I went, because you would ring up for an open spot, they'd give you one within a week or two. Sometimes I actually got one that same night. I rang up and said, yeah, can you come tonight? And I did. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. But there was quite a few clubs. I think there was about 30 clubs in London at the time. You just ring up and get an open spot. But the other thing was, if you did well in the open spot, you could get a booking within a week or two. It was brilliant. So, I think it was about 2 months after I went to London. I was actually, well, I couldn't say I was making a living, but I was earning money from being a comedian. And I couldn't believe it, because I'd spent years in Dublin doing shitty jobs I hated. So I was on top of the world. Even though I wasn't earning much money, I was still earning money. So I started doing these gigs, open spots, and I was getting a few bookings as well. I had a few sort of near deaths, and one horrible death I remember. A comedian always remembers his first horrible death, because I remember you get paranoid, and I actually, the day after I had this horrible death, I didn't move out of my bedsit, because I was afraid somebody in the audience might sort of come along and see me. That's how paranoid you get. You get a little bit more relaxed as you go along. But I had a few deaths, and most of the gigs went fairly well. And I'd been in London for about a year at this stage. I think it was then I wrote my kind of signature or marquee joke, which has since become viral on Twitter. And it was also based on loosely based on an actual event. I was in a pub one night, and there was this big bloke standing beside me. He obviously heard my accent, because he said, excuse me, are you from Dublin? And I said, yes, I am, yeah. And he said, oh, do you know a bloke called Sean Corcoran then? Fuck's sake, there are over 1 million people living in Dublin, for Christ's sake, But the annoying thing was, I fucking do know Sean Corcoran. So that joke worked really well. I knew I was kind of getting there. But now the main thing is, if you're doing the comedy circuit in London, then it might be even the same now. I don't know. The ultimate goal was to get a gig in the Comedy Store in Leicester Square. That was kind of, if you were gigging in the Comedy Store, you kind of made it. But I didn't try the Comedy Store for a while. I waited for about a year, and it was quite soon after I wrote my signature joke of Sean Corcoran, I thought, I think I'm ready to give it a go. I mean, there's no guarantee whether you're going to go well or not, but I knew I couldn't get much more ready for it, if you like, for an open spot in the Comedy Store. So I rang them up and I got an open spot. And I was petrified, because it was a very intimidating atmosphere at the Comedy Store. There was, it's not the Comedy Store that's now, it was in Leicester Square. I was down a bit. It wasn't a basement, but it was really, really basementy. There was kind of pillars and things like that, and people had their views obscured, and there was a lot of heckling going on. Now, they gave me an open spot, but they used to do two shows. One was the early show, which started at 8 o'clock, and the other one was the midnight show, which started at midnight, obviously. But they only gave me, maybe they did it purposely to test you out, but they only gave me a show, an open spot on the midnight show, which can be really, really vicious. I mean, if they don't like you, they just go for your throat. But if they do like you, or if they did like you, it was brilliant, because they would really go for it. They wouldn't hold back. So I didn't know what to expect, but I was pretty petrified. I remember I didn't eat for about 2 days before the gig, literally 2 days. I must have ate something, but I didn't eat a proper meal. Maybe had a packet of crisps or something, I don't know, or a ginger nut, who knows. Anyway, I didn't eat for a couple of days, but so I went to the Comedy Store with my heart in my mouth. And I remember sort of prancing about for about an hour before I went on, and my heart was thumping. I thought I'm not going to be able to say a word. I just grew up and I'm going to be fucking speechless. But anyway, it was my turn, and I was invited, introduced on stage. Unfortunately, fortunately, my opening gag, which is like most people remember, I was born a Catholic, which came as a bit of a shock to my parents, about Jewish, stormed it, and they kind of took to me from there. I didn't have to bother. I did 5 minutes of my open spot material, and I stormed it. And I couldn't believe it when I came off stage. The guy who ran the Comedy Store actually gave me a booking. I couldn't believe it. I was only in London for a year, and I had a booking in the Comedy Store for 3 weeks later. And the thing about the Comedy Store was, once you're doing the Comedy Store, people sort of start to take notice of you. And I was particularly lucky because the guy who ran the Comedy Store, a guy called Kim Kinney, a Scottish guy who's dead now, but we kind of became friends, and he really liked my act, so he used to book me quite regularly, and I was kind of doing the Comedy Store every 2 or 3 weeks. And it wasn't necessarily to the detriment of other comedians, because I said there were only about 30, 40 comedians at the time, and not all of them would suit the Comedy Store, because you had to get straight in. You couldn't sort of tell a long story for 10 minutes or you'd be booed off. So I was doing the Comedy Store regularly at this stage, and nearly every second or third weekend. And I was getting noticed, and I got a spot on Friday Night Live on television. The show was introduced by Ben Elton. Then I also got another spot on Clive Anderson Talks Back, in which I told hey you, what are you doing, my garden joke. So I began to get noticed, and as you're doing more television you do, the more people notice you. And I got this call. It was about 3 months after I'd been doing the Comedy Store regularly, from my agent, who said there was a company in London, they really wanted me for a part in a new film they were doing called The Commitments. They wanted me to play the part of a saxophone player who was part of the band called The Commitments. And my agent told me, so they're looking for a saxophonist who's quite deadpan, quite low key. And I thought that suits me perfectly. So it was about 2 weeks later I went for the audition, and it was in Dublin, in fact. I had to go back to Dublin. But the director was there, Alan Parker, that's his name. I think he's dead now, but he's quite famous, I think. I didn't really know, but he was quite famous for a few films. And there was also the casting director was there. So they gave me the stuff to read for this guy, the character called Joey the Lips in The Commitments. So I read it in my sort of deadpan, downbeat sort of way, and as I was doing it, they didn't say anything, but I got this sense from the corner of my eye that they were both kind of looking at each other, thinking, "What the fuck is this?" They sort of looked a bit bewildered. Anyway, I carried on. I think it lasted for about 5 minutes or something like that, and they thanked me at the end, and I left. But doing these, you never really know, doing auditions for a film or TV, what they think of you, because they never really commit to you at the time. They say, other people to see and all that. But I knew there's something wrong. I knew it hadn't gone well. And obviously I didn't get the part, as you might well know. But I discovered it was about 3 months later, I think it was somebody who had been in The Commitments, I discovered that my agent, fucking idiot, had got it wrong. They were not looking for a deadpan, downbeat saxophonist. It was the complete opposite. My agent had fucked up because there was another act on our books who was going for an audition, and he was quite upbeat. But he went to the interview for the audition for, I think it was a Deadpan Postman or something like that. He was quite upbeat. He went for the audition of the Deadpan Postman, and I, Mr. Downbeat, went for the audition as Joey the Lips, who, if you've seen the film, he's totally out there, totally effervescent. my agent completely fucked up. And if my agent hadn't screwed up, I could well have been Joey the Lips from The Commitments. There you go, that was episode 5 of the podcast, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have been downloading any of the episodes, if you could, I know you've all got busy lives and all that, but if you do get a chance, if you could leave a like or a comment or a review or a rating on the podcast website, that would help, because it does help the profile of the podcast. So it'd be good to hear from you. And once again, the email is whatareyoudoinginmygarden@gmail.com, and you can also get us on Twitter at Waydim. That's the Waydim is basically the initials of What Are You Doing in My Garden, WAYDIMG. So do please get in touch. It'd be great to get your feedback, and we'll be back next week with episode 6 of the podcast, which is called Pole Vaulting Geriatrics and a Global Prank on Piers Morgan. Right, so that's about it, except for time now for our Cointreau Cocktail of the Week. So it's time for Michael's Cointreau Cocktail Recipe of the Week, which this week is called the Frenchy Sour. Hope you've all donned your smoking jackets and your cravats and are sitting comfortably. So here we go with my recipe for the Frenchy Sour Cointreau Cocktail. Actually, the word Frenchy Sour reminds me of an old girlfriend. So just very quickly, bonjour Monique. Okay, here we go with the recipe of the Frenchy Sour Cointreau Cocktail. You will need 25 millilitres of egg white, 30 millilitres of Cointreau, 60 millilitres of white grape juice, and just 20 millilitres of lemon or lime juice, whichever your choice. I personally prefer lime juice, but it's up to you. So there you go. Do make one. Let us know how you got on. I've just made one, and I'm drinking it now. It's really nice. Right, so that's it for this week. Hopefully see you next week. All the best. Cheers. Bye-bye.